to House Speaker John Boehner. Maura Gillespie. Thank you so much for giving us a little bit of your time here on this Sunday afternoon. Greatly appreciate it. I want to talk to you really about just the nature of these shutdowns. We saw the Democrats behind the shutdown in the fall, and that was about health care. And their polling showed the Democrats had that as a good issue for the Democratic Party. Now, this partial shutdown is tied to the Department of Homeland Security reining in ICE. Either way, regardless of how Americans feel about a particular issue, and there are concerns being raised by the American public, we see that in polling about the issue of ICE and Homeland Security and how things are happening. But government shutdowns, are they ever broadly popular with the American people?
Absolutely not. And we see that through polling of Congress's approval rating is at an all-time low, typically, especially after a government shutdown, because I think by and large, the American people see that as Congress not working and not doing the job that we as voters pay them to do. And so government shutdown is never a good solution. It just shows us the dysfunction, unfortunately, in Washington. But I think that Republicans in Congress, especially, under Senator John Thune's, kind of direction, they're hopeful that the House can come back on Monday and vote through a continuing resolution, because I think what this does is presents an opportunity to Republicans and Democrats alike to really focus on the resources being used at DHS. And I think that for Republicans, immigration, you mentioned healthcare being an important issue for Democrats. That usually was a winning issue for them. Immigration and border security has long been a stalwart of the Republican agenda that they tend to do well on. And so this is a chance for them to kind of reclaim that narrative.
Yeah, it's interesting you mention that, because it seems to be there's actually some middle ground on the border issue in particular among Republicans, Democrats, independents in particular seem to be positive there. But then when it comes to the other issue of immigration and the aggressiveness of federal authorities, they seem to be losing a little ground to the GOP on that particular issue. Your thoughts on what that could mean for these midterms?
It's definitely a problem for Republicans if they don't take the reins back. And I think what you saw on Thursday when Tom Homan came through and said, we're going to refocus back on the initial mission, which most Americans support. I want to say all Americans support, but I'll go ahead and say most Americans support making sure that we hold those criminal, undocumented who have committed heinous crimes, hold them accountable to the full extent of the law, hold them, making sure that that's where our resources go, that ICE agents are targeting those individuals and making sure that we are keeping our community safer. And what most Americans have been seeing as of late was a bit of chaoticness being shown to the American public and not feeling safe in their own communities, in their own towns and cities. And so I do think that Tom Homan talking on Thursday, Caroline Leavitt reiterating that the president is focused on the targeted mission, that's going to help Republicans in Congress to go back to their constituents and say, here's what we're focused on. We are targeting those criminal, undocumented. We want to use our resources well. And this chance to really look at what DHS is spending on is a good chance for Republicans to take back that narrative about our economic standing, right? I mean, I think we talk about budget and fiscal conservatism. That's what they need to be focused on, is how are we using that money? And is it the best use of our resources, targeting those criminals as opposed to, a 5-year-old being flown back and forth, a 2-year-old from Chicago being flown back and forth to Texas. I think what's really important is Republicans are going to focus on what DHS is spending and wanting to ensure that we have a good, healthy budget there to get done what needs to be done.
Yeah, and the president has been trying to talk about that economic issue. He went out to Iowa, but the headlines keep going back over to this issue of immigration, of ICE, of what's happening in Minnesota, of the protests going on across the nation. And the Democrats seem fairly invested in this. There's this New York Times quote on the Democratic fight. This from January 26th. The headline, Democrats embrace a shutdown that they wanted to avoid. Quote, in January 2018, Democrats forced the government to shut down as they tried to win legal protections for hundreds of thousands of so-called dreamers, undocumented immigrants brought into the country as children. But they backed down 3 days in when they determined that they lacked popular support for the tactic. Though immigration policy is part of this dispute, Democrats see it as a dramatically different situation in which the public is squarely behind them. They say they are willing to take the heat to win new limits on federal agents. This is sort of the bet that they're making. Is the American public behind them and willing to give them some leeway on this particular partial government shutdown?
What I think will be most interesting here and important to keep an eye on is whether or not the Democratic Party can be disciplined in their messaging. I think what you've seen, unfortunately, so many on the far left are saying defund ICE, abolish ICE, and they know that this is not a helpful messaging tactic for their party, because for the country at large, that's not what we're asking for. What we're asking for, I think, in a broader sense, is a more targeted approach. I do think that you've seen polling across different spectrums that show that people are not supportive of the overly aggressive tactics that have been implemented by Kristi Noem and Corey Lewandowski and Stephen Miller. But I think there's a separation there with what Tom Homan and President Trump and Caroline Leavitt have been expressing, was that this targeted approach is more in line with what the vast majority of the American people want to see. But I don't think that the Democrats, I understand their tactic here, their attempts to think that they can ride off of the polling number that has shown that Americans are upset with what the current status is. But I don't think that they are equipped to handle immigration as a policy that's going to be a winning policy for them, because they're not as disciplined on the messaging as a whole, whereas Republicans typically are.
Maura Gillespie, thank you very much. We greatly appreciate your insights. Inching closer to the midterms, we'll be talking about them a lot more. Thank you very much.
Absolutely.